My name is Owen Symes, and welcome to The Copropagandists, a podcast about cop shows and the people who make them. As we've already established, Jack Webb had, by the end of the 1950s, forged himself into something of a TV auteur. Not only did he dominate or influence the whole creative process behind Dragnet, from paper to celluloid, but he also for a number of years exerted considerable sway over U.S. popular culture. The beginning of the 1960s, however, were kind of a nadir for him, with a series of underperforming follow-ups to his prior success on Dragnet that forced him, by the end of the decade, to return once more to the police procedural. As he foundered, however, new producers, new creatives were beginning to emerge to put their own unique stamp on the cop show. We've already run into Frederick Ziv and his Highway Patrol, which sought to emulate Dragnet while pinching as many pennies as possible. Now we'll take a look at someone who emerged right as Dragnet was ending, a man who would, by the 1970s, become one of the mainstays of the U.S. television diet, Quinn Martin. While Webb has been recognized by posterity as an auteur of early television, a key player in the development and success of the form and medium, Martin has received comparatively less critical or scholarly attention. Some of this is understandable. After all, Webb emerged during the golden age of TV and was something of a founding father of the medium. Martin, who began producing shows a decade after Webb, was no foundation layer. He did not innovate like Webb. Instead, as we'll see, he was a master iterator, someone who could build upon existing foundations while putting his own particular artistic and ideological stamp on the finished product. For 2 decades, that product filled our airwaves. Since we've already covered the background context of radio, early TV history, the first TV crime shows, and the massive success of early cop shows like Dragnet and Highway Patrol in the 1950s, I'll start us off here with the origins of Quinn Martin's Hollywood career in particular. His earliest experiences were somewhat different from Webb's. Whereas Webb had come up from practically the bottom, Martin seems to have grown up in relative comfort. Born Irwin Martin Cohn in New York City, 1922, to Jewish parents, Martin and his 2 siblings were moved out to Los Angeles in 1925, where his father, Martin G. Cohn, worked as a film editor and producer for MGM. In fact, in 1937, the elder Cohn helped found the Society of Motion Picture Film Editors, acting as its first treasurer. Quinn Martin joined the U.S. Army Signal Corps in 1939, around the age of 17, and there worked for the duration of World War II, seeing both the European and Pacific theaters and ultimately achieving the rank of sergeant. Again, this contrasted with Webb and his military career, which saw him in the U.S. Army Air Corps, but grounded stateside until he managed to acquire an early discharge. Upon leaving the Army, Martin attended the University of California at Berkeley. He majored in English with an emphasis on creative writing. Although expressing some interest in a newspaper career, he ultimately decided to enter Hollywood, following his dad into MGM Studios, where he obtained a low-level job. His resume grew quickly, with stints at Ziv TV and Desilu Productions, the company behind that other 1950s mega hit, I Love Lucy. While the historical record indicates that he worked prodigiously in this period, the details are a little hazy. Martin himself has described his work in this period as editing, telling an interviewer in the early 1980s, for instance, that he became the head of an editing department. He doesn't specify when or where. A contemporary newspaper article gives support to this, describing Martin in August 1954 as the film editor of I Love Lucy. Yet his IMDb credits do not reflect this. They only show him as working in the audio department of some 9 shows in the mid-1950s. I Love Lucy is not among these, but he was the audio supervisor on 55 episodes of Highway Patrol, of all things. Indeed, the announcement of his Christmas 1955 marriage describes him not as an editor, but as an audio man. Quote, Madeline Pugh, who does scripts for I Love Lucy, was married Christmas Eve to Quinn Martin, sound expert with Ziv Productions. Now, this just goes to show how understudied Martin's biography has been up to this point. The key here, I think, is an interview with I Love Lucy sound editor Dan Cohn, who worked on the show from its inception. According to Cohn, both he and Martin were young men working under their fathers, editing different shows in the early 1950s. Martin was at Universal doing some sound work for Francis the Talking Mule, making sure that the voice matched the mule's movements. The two met, and Cohn convinced Martin to do additional sound editing on I Love Lucy.
I talked him into coming down and meeting Jess Oppenheimer and Al Simon, and he did. And we convinced him that this was going to be a hit and that he should join us. So Quinn Martin came in to do the sound effects, the little and smoothing out. See, I had to go out with this show at 26 and a half minutes. And if we got hilarious laughs at something funny Lucy did, it would stretch the film. And no matter how much timing they worked at to come in at 26 or 27 minutes, it always went over. Sometimes not much, sometimes a hilarious piece of business, very much. So I'd be chopping up the soundtrack and chopping up the laugh track, and it all had to be what we call smoothed out.
So in other words, Martin did do editing work, it was just audio editing. And maybe that got shortened over the years when he was doing interviews to just editing. And then other people assumed he meant film editing when he actually meant audio work. At any rate, what Quinn really wanted to do was produce. That is to say, he didn't want to do grunt work and underling work his whole career. He wanted to lead a show's operations. And to do that, as he recounted in a 1980s interview, meant that he had to prove his creativity. He had to write. Quote, "The only way I could produce, prove that I was creative, was to write. So I started writing for television." Dan Cohn, that I Love Lucy editor, recounts Martin moonlighting as a writer while still doing his audio work.
And he was working at Universal on Francis the Mule, where he was putting the voice of the mule into the mule. And he had a very comfortable job, and he wanted to make it as a writer, and he had plenty of time at a major studio to do his writing, and he was very content.
In 1954, Martin received his first writing credit on a third-season episode of the four-star Playhouse. The next year, he wrote an episode for Stage 7, and then one for Desilu's Jane Wyman Show, where he eventually became head writer. By 1958, his plan had paid off. When a producer on the Jane Wyman Show was fired, Martin successfully sold himself to management as the best man to fill the slot. He then helped put together material for an anthology show, the Desilu Playhouse, where he then served as producer on 10 episodes. In 1959, the head of Desilu, Desi Arnaz, came to Martin with a new cop show in need of an executive producer, one that took advantage of a growing trend in U.S. media at the time, the revival of the gangster. The gangster had been big in the 1930s, with plenty of Hollywood films causing controversy and box office numbers, but had fallen out of favor by the 40s. This began to change again in 1951, as televisions across the country aired footage from the Kefauver hearings on organized crime.
In 1951, a special committee of the United States Senate held public hearings which, largely through the impact of television, dominated the attention of the American people. It was Kefauver versus crime, and a nation watched, fascinated.
This investigation contained testimonies from well-known criminals like Tony Anastasia and Frank Costello, and it was one of the first instances of national news experienced via the medium of television, with Variety describing the hearings as a new and irresistible form of public entertainment. How right they were. The hearings themselves focused on the idea of organized crime as a subject of national concern as had not been seen since the days of Volstead, of Prohibition. By 1957, the mafia was exploding across the press, with the assassination of Murder, Inc. chief Albert Anastasia, the police discovery of a secret mafia conference in rural New York State, and the trickling in of reports of elder mobsters dying peacefully, never having felt any consequence for their violent past. With mobsters new and old in the public consciousness, pop culture got to work with movies like Babyface Nelson in 57, The Bonnie Parker Story in 58, I, Mobster in 59, and Al Capone also in 59. This last one in particular felt the ire of the censors, with the script being rejected until the protagonist was changed from a gangster to a police officer. And even so, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, denounced it as glorifying criminals. But heedless of any official sanction or censure, this new crop of gangster films made it clear that there was indeed an audience for this material once more. But that was film. TV took a little longer to catch on to the trend. Remember that even in the late 1950s, with the popularity of Dragnet, the Western still dominated the small screen. Still, a few gangster productions had begun to trickle onto the airwaves. Notably, Franklin Schaffner, who would go on to direct Planet of the Apes, directed Seven Against the Wall in 1958, a live show presenting Al Capone's machinations against rival gangsters that resulted in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The next year would see the release of 3 Prohibition-era serials: Pete Kelly's Blues, helmed by Jack Webb, lasted 1 year, The Lawless Years, which ran for a couple of seasons, and The Untouchables. Only this last entry, based on the exploits of Treasury agent Eliot Ness, found sustained success. The Untouchables was based on Eliot Ness's autobiography of the same title, written with, and mostly by, journalist Oscar Frehley, which had gone to press in 1957, by which point Ness himself had already died. The Treasury agent's passing actually failed to make national headlines. Indeed, his fame during the days of Prohibition had proven effervescent, so that by the time the Cold War began, he'd been all but forgotten. His memoirs didn't put his name back in the front page, but it inspired those who would. The events that would lead the real Eliot Ness to notoriety began in 1929 with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, wherein several gangsters were killed by their rivals. The carnage and press coverage prompted public outcry against lawlessness and gangsterism and incentivized a federal push against Al Capone's Chicago empire in particular. The feds decided on a 2-pronged approach to attack Capone: financial, going after him for tax evasion, and industrial, going after his hidden breweries, which would also, it was hoped, aid in the tax evasion case. Elmer Irie from the IRS led the first prong, Eliot Ness the second. And Ness was aggressive. His initial raids targeted the Chicago Heights mob, which he mistakenly believed to be part of Capone's operations. The unsatisfying results of these raids, along with the corruption endemic within the Chicago police, prompted Ness to strike out on his own with a hand-picked task force. After some initial setbacks and growing pains, Ness and his men soon began to master the art of brewery raiding, as when they adapted a 10-ton truck for use as a battering ram, which they used for rapid entry into locked facilities. Wiretapping and an informant allowed these raids to be executed with far more planning than hitherto had been possible. When Ness first formed his special squad, Capone had been in jail. When he emerged in early 1930 and took stock of the damage that Ness had already done, his first response was, as is typical, attempted bribery. Ness refused, reportedly with much anger, and several other agents were unsuccessfully approached as well. At this point, Ness called a press conference to announce the bribery attempts, and it was from this event that a reporter at the Chicago Tribune coined the phrase, the Untouchables. When bribery failed, violence followed. Ness's memoirs assert 4 attempts on his life. Wiretapping alerted the feds to the first, and the other 3, a drive-by, a hit-and-run, and an attempted dynamiting, are disputed by some historians, but it's certainly clear that Capone wanted Ness neutralized in some fashion. In addition to these assassination attempts, harassment like slashed tires, surveillance, and attempted blackmail also took place. Ness's notoriety climaxed around 1931. Although prosecutors did not ultimately go after Capone for violating the Volstead Act, choosing instead to focus solely on his tax evasion, some of the evidence they ultimately relied upon was gathered by Ness and his men. As summarized by Ness himself in 1934, "We did our part, of course, but the real work of sending Capone to prison was done by the tax investigators. Our job was more spectacular. That was all." After the end of Prohibition, Ness moved to Cleveland to become a safety director. There he achieved some success against local criminals, notably toppling several powerful labor racketeers. He also worked to provide city cops and firefighters with new equipment, founded the Cleveland Police Academy, worked to combat juvenile delinquency, whatever that means, and removed some corrupt police from the department. After this, he briefly entered the private sector before trying his hand at electoral politics by running for Cleveland mayor in 1947 on a Republican ticket. His Democratic opponent trounced him, which essentially ended Ness's public life. A series of moves and mediocre jobs followed until he met journalist Oscar Frehley in the 1950s. This began a collaboration that would ultimately rescue Ness from oblivion, albeit indirectly. And here we come to the figure of Desi Arnaz. In the late 1950s, Desilu Productions, helmed by husband-wife team Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, had become a TV mainstay. The success of I Love Lucy had catapulted the duo into stardom. But that show had ended in 1957, at which point they had begun looking for the next big thing. That same year, Arnaz himself expanded the company's production capabilities by purchasing RKO, the venerable film studio responsible for Citizen Kane. This purchase gave Desilu access to sound stages, production facilities, and a backlot, all of which were needed for larger-scale programs. Now, Ness's memoirs did not at first blush seem like the right material for Desilu. The company had made a name for itself, after all, through its lighthearted slapstick sitcom. Arnaz himself had spoken out against violence on TV in language reminiscent of the NAB's TV Code of Ethics. Compare, for instance, this remark of Arnaz, quote, "Our policy has been never to do shows of violence or a psychopathic nature, of adultery or such things. These may be fine on a stage or in a movie theater, but they should not be put on a TV screen in a person's home." Compare that with this introductory statement from the 1952 TV Code. Quote, "Television is seen and heard in every type of American home. These homes include children and adults of all ages, embrace all races and all varieties of religious faith, and reach those of every educational background. It is the responsibility of television to bear constantly in mind that the audience is primarily a home audience, and consequently that television's relationship to the viewer is that between guest and host." But nevertheless, several things attracted Arnaz to the material. Desilu, newly formed as a public company with stockholders to please, needed something new and exciting as a follow-up to I Love Lucy. Moreover, Ness's book would inevitably be adapted by someone, so it might as well be Desilu. And the wealth of material lent itself not just to a powerful movie, but perhaps to a long-running TV series as well. Lastly, Arnaz himself briefly thought of the production as a new vehicle for his own stardom, with him playing the part of Eliot Ness. Now, he was ultimately dissuaded from doing so. After all, the viewing public might not have enjoyed watching Ricky Ricardo, his comedic and high-strung persona on I Love Lucy, gunning after gangsters. To secure the rights, Arnaz had to go through Warner Brothers. He'd recently been offered a package of their properties, both IPs and finished products, but had told the sellers that he did not want the whole thing, just a few properties, including the rights to adapt The Untouchables. But they didn't want to sell piecemeal, so he had to wait for the rights to lapse. Once they did, he snagged them up, and production began in 1959. Arnaz found the initial script problematic, and even contemplated using the book itself as a shooting script, should the writer fail to deliver what he wanted. As he recalled, "When I got the first draft, The Untouchables had become a psychological study of what made gangsters be gangsters, which was not what I wanted. I wanted plain cops and robbers. As the script was improved, Arnaz secured broadcasting rights through CBS and tapped Quinn Martin to serve as executive producer. With the rights acquired, an executive producer in place, and a script on its way, Desilu now had to fund this 2-hour movie. Now, this was to be the most expensive TV program made up to that point. According to Variety at the time, each of the 2 parts of this show, 1 hour, was to be budgeted at $300,000. But additional scenes and production costs increased costs up to $1 million total. For the sake of comparison, the 1951 pilot episode of Dragnet cost about $40,000. In order to recoup this investment, Desilu was committed to releasing this 2-part movie as a theatrical experience in Europe, an early example of what became common practice during the network TV era. Take a made-for-TV movie, produced for television, and release it theatrically abroad. In order to help ensure that the film enticed European audiences, Arnaz wanted a known film star to helm the project. Initially, he went after Van Heflin, but he turned it down because he had no interest in the grueling schedule of TV production. Van Johnson came next, although when he realized he wasn't being paid as much as he originally thought, he dropped out at the last second. With only a weekend to find a replacement before production began, Arnaz made a series of rapid-fire phone calls, came across Robert Stack, and contacted him. Stack himself was uninterested at first owing to his desire to become a film star, a Hollywood star. Remember, film and television, very separate at this time. But he ultimately agreed. The money was just too good to pass up. Narration would be provided by Prohibition-era journalist Walter Winchell, who'd previously worked on a radio program for Arnaz. When the script finally came in that was acceptable to Arnaz, it had been written by a guy named Paul Monash and adhered quite closely to the narrative as presented in Ness's book, a biased but not wildly inaccurate presentation of events. By adhering so closely to the book, however, the finished product came off as structurally awkward. Remember that what really undid Capone was his conviction for tax evasion. This left the memoir, which prioritized the spectacular but ultimately secondary war against Capone's breweries, with a problem. How to focus on the action while still ultimately coming to a factual conclusion. The answer was to make an abrupt and undramatic left turn in the third act, turning away from the smashing of distilleries and towards the shuffle of paperwork. Hence, both book and program ended with a truncated court case only tangentially related to Ness himself. Observed one historian decades later, by adhering closely to history, the script deprives the teleplay of a dynamic conclusion.
Westinghouse, first with the future, presents the Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse. Tonight's show, The Untouchables, starring Robert Stack.
Chicago, 1929. By law, the country was dry. Through connivance with Al Capone, Chicago was wet. Even now, while Al Capone served a short term for carrying a gun in Philadelphia, the organization functioned smoothly, helped by corrupt officials and a public that was indifferent. Social headquarters of the mob was the Café Montmartre. This night, the night of June 17th, 1929, the gang was to encounter its chief adversary, a prohibition agent named Eliot Ness.
What if you have a special squad? Small, operating on its own. Every man thoroughly investigated. Brought in from all parts of the country. Men who'll spit on Capone's graft. Just a few he can't buy.
You think you can find these men?
I think so.
You cops, you're all robbers. How much you want? Come on, tell me, how much you want?
Not a cent.
You're crazy. I ask you, how much?
The breweries.
The breweries were the heart of the Capone empire, the heart and the Achilles heel. Stills producing booze could be set up quickly and inexpensively. Breweries represented great investments of time and money, and very great profits. So they were artfully concealed and further protected by huge payments of graft. In the 11 months before the night of July 28th, not one Capone brewery had been touched by any law enforcement agency in Chicago. In the following weeks, using information gathered through the tap of Nitty's phone, Eliot Ness's special squad located and wrecked 4 more Capone breweries. At midnight, a rendezvous was made with other agents in the warehouse used by Ness's squad. The men were briefed on their assignments.
Just to help you find the way, I'm putting one of my own men on each of the cars. They'll be in charge after we get inside. You don't know the layout, but you'll be able to size things up fast. If there's any resistance, let them have it. Any questions? Let's go.
With Capone's power to frighten and corrupt diminishing, people began to give information. With the assistance of Eliot Ness, U.S. Treasury agents started to put together the mosaic of an income tax evasion case against Al Capone.
When the two-parter aired in April 1959, it proved an immediate ratings hit. The first part drew in 56% of the available audience when it premiered, and the second part did even better, almost 65%. This is the kind of national ubiquity that's hardly imaginable today. The critics took a little while longer to come on board, with reception for Part 1 being mixed at best. Part 2, however, took the trade publications by storm. Variety gushed. The episode was fast-paced and accurate. Camera work was striking. Desilu pulled out all the stops for producer Quinn Martin on this one, striving for authenticity and production scope. Cecil Smith of the LA Times praised the show as a factual study of the breakup of the Capone empire. With the rousing success of the initial broadcast, plans quickly proceeded to release the product theatrically, both in Europe and now also the United States. They really had a hot potato on their hands here, and they wanted all the money they could get out of it. Retitled The Scarface Mob, it released in early 1960 in Europe, and then with slightly different editing in the United States in 1962. Getting the show to series, however, proved more difficult. According to Paul Monash, who wrote the screenplay for the pilot, The Untouchables had always been intended to be a series, and given the success of the pilot, Arnaz and Desilu immediately went to CBS to hash out an agreement for more episodes. But when they contacted CBS, the network declined, with one executive expressing doubt about what future adventures Ness could even go on with Capone already kaput. Moreover, the network told Arnaz that they were actually already working with Paramount to produce another gangster show, and as a rule, they didn't like to have multiple producers with similar shows on at the same time. Enter ABC, the third place network. One executive there, Ollie Trays, strongly desired to broadcast more of Eliot Ness and his adventures. As with the pilot, Quinn Martin was retained as executive producer through the first season. Unlike the pilot, which cost many hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour, going forward, each episode was slated to run about $110,000, still more than double the typical Dragnet. Charged with spending the show's budget, Martin spared no expense, pushing his team to use night-for-night shooting on location wherever possible, and to keep the action intense. Never a cheap thing. He also pushed for particular people to work on the show. For instance, retaining the narrator, Walter Winchell, who ABC was initially not interested in keeping around. The two major difficulties that Martin ran into early on were his star and his scripts. ABC wanted Robert Stack, obviously, to continue starring in the series, but Stack felt reticent about continuing to work in TV. He still wanted that Hollywood stardom. By way of compromise, he agreed early on that his involvement would be limited. He would star in only 11 of the upcoming episodes, but he would host the remainder. Filming began in August of 1959 with a premiere set for October. By this point, Stack had reconsidered and would, in fact, remain as the show's star for the duration. This isn't really surprising, because in exchange for his involvement, Stack was given the best contract in television. $10,000 per episode, the highest salary at the time, approval over script changes, production decisions, casting, and direction, plus this was only to be a 3-year contract, shorter than the typical 5, thus giving him added flexibility if more film work opened up in a few years. As for the scripts, a question loomed over the show as it went into pre-production. With Capone behind bars at the end of the premiere, what was there left for Ness and company to do? His subsequent career in law enforcement and politics in Cleveland and elsewhere didn't exactly make for series TV material, at least based on the wisdom at the time. The solution arrived at was to have the Ness character reach further afield, beyond the confines of the historical record, there to do battle with the other figures of the prohibited past. Even if, technically, our Treasury agent had never actually interacted with these people. This proved convenient from a dramatic perspective, but as we'll see next time, it was a decision that thorned the side of Desilu Productions for years to come. Thanks for listening to this week's episode covering Quinn Martin's early career and the birth of the Untouchables. Sources are in the show notes. You can find an essay version of this script, complete with detailed citations, on my Substack, Owen Symes. You can also find me on Blue Sky, Owen-Symes, YouTube, Integral History, and if you want, you can check out my book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years. Music by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. See you next time.